Hey there and welcome back to my channel. Now today we're gonna look at a turning point in immigration policy, namely the Chinese Exclusion Act. So if you're ready to get them brain cows milked, then let's get to it. Okay, so before we dive into this law, which might sound like something that would have been passed by the KKK, I just want to make sure that we know what we mean by Chinese. I mean, obviously this is talking about people who were living in China or of Chinese descent. But what does that include? Well, since this was written in 1882, we have to understand that China had already opened up to missionaries and traders in the early 1800s. And after the Opium War, which I talked about in a previous episode, they were forced to open even more ports to foreign influence. This created a pretty big influx of immigrants from China, mostly men who were working as laborers on the railroads, in mining operations or working in small businesses or shops. So when we talk about the Chinese in this video, we're talking specifically about these recent immigrants. Alright, now let's go ahead and get into what motivated this exclusion. Okay, so the Chinese Exclusion Act was born out of an already long history of anti-immigrant sentiment in the United States. I mean, the country went from being populated by people who fled religious persecution in Europe to being populated by people who fled economic hardship in Europe. In other words, the country was built by immigrants, but once they got here, they didn't want other people taking their jobs. And the opportunity for those jobs came during the California gold rush of 1849, when tens of thousands of fortune seekers flooded into the state. By 1852, however, the easily accessible gold was pretty much gone and many of those fortune seekers found themselves out of work. And so they started looking around for someone else to blame. Enter the Chinese. To be fair, the Chinese weren't the only scapegoats. At various times, Irish immigrants, African Americans, and most of the other white ethnics were also blamed for America's woes. But the Chinese were able to withstand this kind of pressure better than others, or at least longer, because of their willingness to work for less money. And so while the working class was willing to accept women and children working in factories, they weren't willing to accept Chinese men. Now, this wasn't anything new. Anti-Chinese sentiment had existed in California since the 1850s and culminated with the passage of the Foreign Miners Act of 1850, which levied a $3 monthly tax on all Chinese miners and then basically took all of their stuff if they couldn't pay it. Now, all of this built up to the 1870s when the railroads were being extended across the western half of the country. And once again, the Chinese were hired for hard labor. But now they faced a new kind of competition, and that was the newly freed African American. See, since the end of the Civil War, former slaves were looking for work, and many of them found it on those same railroads. However, they demanded higher wages, which meant the railroad owners looked elsewhere. And once again, the Chinese fit the bill. But as time went on, the prejudice against the Chinese grew and grew until it reached a boiling point in 1882 with the Chinese Exclusion Act. Okay, so let's take a closer look at the act itself. First of all, this was the first time that immigration restrictions were put in place based solely on nationality. Before this, immigration policy was restricted based on criminal history, national security risks, or public charge status, meaning that a person's likelihood of becoming a burden on the state. But this act specifically singled out one group of people for different treatment, and that was unprecedented. So, while the U.S. had always kept certain groups of people out, this was the first time that an entire group was barred from entry simply because of who they were. Now, the act itself was relatively simple, though its enforcement proved to be quite complicated. It barred the immigration of all Chinese laborers, both skilled and unskilled, and Chinese employed in mining. However, it did make exceptions for merchants, travelers, students, teachers, and diplomats. Enforcement of the act was difficult, however, because of how vague these exceptions were. For instance, if a merchant needed a laborer to help sell his wares, then he could bring that laborer with him. Or if a student needed a tutor to accompany him to school, well, that would be allowed too. Also, since there was no federal registry of Chinese immigrants already living in the country, it was difficult to figure out who was supposed to be here and who wasn't. So oftentimes, even native-born Chinese Americans were deported under this act because it was difficult to prove citizenship. In fact, from 1882 to 1902, 13,000 Chinese people were deported, even though they had been born in the U.S. But in 1905, the act was amended to require registration of Chinese already living in the country, and that helped reduce the number of deportations. Okay, now let's see why this act was such a big deal. First of all, as I said earlier, this was the first time in American history that an entire group of people was singled out and banned from immigrating to the U.S. In doing so, this set a terrible precedent and gave the government a roadmap for future acts of exclusion. For instance, in 1917, the Immigration Act barred people from entering the U.S. if they had come from any of these countries, and it didn't matter whether or not they were actually citizens of those countries. Also, it set the stage for the National Origins Plan of 1929, which severely restricted immigration from certain countries based on quotas. Also, the Chinese Exclusion Act reveals an important shift in the Republican Party's platform. Remember, the Republican Party used to be known as the Party of Lincoln and was founded on the idea of opposing slavery. But by the late 1800s, they had completely shifted to protecting the interests of big business. And that meant supporting things like the Chinese Exclusion Act, which would keep wages high and protect American jobs. Finally, this act revealed a dark underbelly of American society, namely that even though the U.S. likes to think of itself as a land of freedom and opportunity, that's really only for certain people. The Chinese Exclusion Act revealed the ugly side of the melting pot, where certain groups were not only unwelcome, but outright banned from participating in American life. Okay, that's what we're looking at today. You know, we tend to remember the good things about the US, and rightfully so, but it is also important to look at the bad stuffs so that we can learn from our mistakes and try to make sure that we never repeat them. Okay, click right over here to grab a review packet if you need help getting in your class and a 5 on your exam in May. And additionally, click right over here if you want me to keep making these videos. And finally, if you want me to keep making these videos, then subscribe and leave me a comment. Tell me what you want me to make videos on, and tell me what you thought about this video. Did I miss something? Did I misrepresent something? You know, sometimes I get things wrong. So if you catch me in a mistake, then let me know. Anyway, thank you guys so much for watching. I hope that you learned something, and I will see you next time. In this video, we're going to look at another one of your acquired APUSH topics. Specifically, we were going to look at how the United States went from being an America for Americans nation to an America for white Americans nation. And to understand that change, we need to focus on the Chinese, not the Irish. So if you're ready to get them brain cows milked, let's get to it. Okay. Before we get into the meat of this video, if you need help getting in your class and a 5 on your exam in May, then click right over here in the review packet. It has got everything you need to know in one concise packet that you can print out right at home. Okay, so let's begin with some context. From the 1880s through the 1920s, many European nations, including the United States, were undergoing significant industrialization. Now, where does that leave us? Well, as industrialization increased, the demand for raw materials also increased. As the United States expanded across the continent, it encountered lots of resources like gold, silver, oil, coal, and more. And all of those were put to use pretty quickly. However, other parts of the world were also rich in natural resources. And as industrialization progressed, American companies began seeking natural resources overseas. And because of this increased connection to other parts of the world, immigration to the United States actually increased significantly during this period. Now, remember what I've been saying throughout these videos about push and pull factors. Well, here are some of the push and pull factors that applied to Chinese immigrants specifically. In China, there was a growing population, which meant fewer opportunities for employment and economic security. Meanwhile, in the United States, there was a booming economy and lots of opportunity for employment. So people from China were pushed out of their homeland by economic insecurity and pulled into the United States by economic opportunity. Also, just to be clear, when we say China during this period, we're referring to a region of the world, not the modern People's Republic of China. The Qing dynasty had fallen in 1911, and there was a good bit of instability in the region, which also encouraged people to seek a new life somewhere else. Anyway, by 1900, approximately 200,000 Chinese immigrants lived in the United States. Now, why is that number important? Well, it represents a high concentration of immigrants from one specific area coming to the United States in a relatively short period of time. And whenever a large group of people from a specific culture come to a new place, there are bound to be tensions that arise. And that's exactly what happened. Many white Americans viewed the Chinese immigrants as a threat, and there are three main reasons for that. First, there was lots of competition for jobs. Many of the Chinese immigrants were willing to work for less money than white Americans, which made them more attractive to employers. To make matters worse, many of them were employed in mining and railroad work, which were dangerous professions even under the best of circumstances. And when you factor in that they were working for long hours in dangerous conditions for really low pay, well, it created a lot of resentment among white workers. Second, the Chinese were seen as culturally and racially inferior. Remember, during this period, there was lots of pseudo-scientific racism going on. Basically, the idea that some races were biologically superior to others. And to support this view, white Americans pointed to the fact that the Chinese had what was referred to as an Asian pigmentation, which meant they didn't look like white folks. They were darker. So clearly they were inferior. The third reason that white Americans disliked the Chinese so much is that many of them had converted to Christianity. And that meant that they looked down on the Chinese for being animists and practicing what white Americans viewed as a false religion. So with all of that tension building in the background, something happened in the city of Rock Springs, Wyoming in 1905 that turned anti-Chinese sentiment into full-blown racism. See, in Rock Springs, there was a lot of tension between the Chinese immigrants and the white miners. Eventually, the two groups came to blows, and after several days of fighting, white miners essentially drove the Chinese out of town. This event is known as the Rock Springs Massacre. And it was the culmination of years of resentment toward the Chinese. And after this incident, things started getting serious. The first major piece of anti-Chinese legislation came in 1904 when the San Francisco Board of Supervisors passed an ordinance requiring that children of Chinese immigrants attend segregated schools separate from white children. The stated purpose of the ordinance was to protect white children from the influence of Chinese culture. Yeah, and that was the beginning. After that decision, several more pieces of legislation passed targeting Chinese immigrants. But the biggest piece of anti-Chinese legislation during this period was the Chinese Exclusion Act of 1906, which built on previous acts that had suspended the immigration of certain Chinese laborers. The 1906 Act barred the entry of Chinese immigrants completely and barred Chinese immigrants already in the United States from becoming citizens. Additionally, those who left the country for any reason whatsoever needed to obtain a certificate from the Bureau of Immigration before re-entering the United States. If they didn't have such a certificate or if they couldn't prove that they were in the United States before 1906, they would be deported. So, why did the United States government pass such harsh legislation? Well, the answer is basically twofold. First, the Republican President Teddy Roosevelt had campaigned on a platform of restricting Chinese immigration, and many members of his party wanted to keep that campaign promise. Second, the Democratic Party largely supported the exclusion of Chinese immigrants as well because many Democrats were white, Southern male, rural and definitely racist. So the result was that in 1906, the Chinese Exclusion Act passed with very little opposition. So what was the overall effect of this legislation? Well, first of all, it kept Chinese immigration at a near standstill for several decades. Prior to the act, approximately 10,000 Chinese immigrants entered the United States each year. After the act passed, only about 700 Chinese immigrants were admitted per year. Furthermore, the requirement for certificates for reentry resulted in thousands of Chinese people leaving the United States for fear of being deported. Before the act, there were approximately 200,000 Chinese immigrants living in the United States. By 1917, that number had dwindled to about 90,000. And lastly, the Chinese Exclusion Act essentially made Chinese immigrants permanent aliens. You see, the act barred Chinese immigrants from ever becoming citizens, which meant that they were denied many of the rights and privileges afforded to other Americans. For example, they could not vote, serve on juries, or even testify in court. Additionally, their children were automatically considered aliens too, even if they were born in the United States. The only way they could escape this perpetual alienage was to leave the country and renounce their citizenship. So why does this topic matter? Well, this topic matters for two main reasons. First, the Chinese Exclusion Act was the first significant piece of legislation that restricted immigration based on race. This set a bad precedent for future legislation like the Immigration Act of 1924, which severely restricted immigration from certain countries in the interest of preserving the racial purity of the United States. Second, the Chinese Exclusion Act helps us understand how the United States went from being an America for Americans nation to an America for white Americans nation. Remember, throughout U.S. history, there has always been a tension between the ideals of the nation and its reality. The ideals, as expressed in documents like the Declaration of Independence and the Constitution, proclaimed that America was a nation built on the principles of equality and freedom. However, the reality was that those ideals were not extended to everyone. Slavery was an obvious example of that. But after slavery ended, other forms of inequality emerged. And the Chinese Exclusion Act is one example of that. The Chinese immigrants were not able to participate fully in American life. They were not able to vote, own property, or even testify in court. The Chinese Exclusion Act helped turn the United States from a nation that welcomed immigrants into a nation that sought to preserve itself by excluding people from the huddled masses yearning to breathe free. Okay, that's what you need to know about this topic. If you want me to keep making these videos, then by all means subscribe and I shall oblige. I'm out. Chinese Exclusion Act. When you think of the worst laws ever, you might be thinking of something like the 1930s German Nuremberg laws, which stripped Jews of their citizenship, or the infamous Jim Crow laws, which enforced racial segregation in the American South. But did you know that the first law to restrict immigration based on race was actually passed by the United States? This is the Chinese Exclusion Act of 1882, one of the most shameful chapters in American history. Let's learn about it. The Chinese have been coming to the U.S. for decades. The first recorded arrival was in 1784 when two Chinese sailors showed up in New York after jumping ship. Most Chinese immigrants were men who came alone seeking work. In the mid-1800s, many fled China due to a devastating famine and civil unrest. Others simply hoped to make enough money in America to return home. They were willing to put up with long hours and hard labor because they were paid less than white workers. This enraged white Americans who believed the Chinese were stealing jobs. In reality, both groups could find employment that better suited them. But white Americans felt threatened by this competition anyway. An economic downturn in the 1870s saw unemployment rates skyrocket, making things worse. Nativist fears of foreign influence were also growing at the time. As author Iris Chang wrote, they were different in appearance, language, customs, and religion. They lived apart from white society and were willing to work for less pay. No one bothered to point out the irony that these very traits were precisely what had made the United States so attractive to the Chinese. White Americans were also nervous about Chinese influence on the West Coast, believing they were taking over San Francisco. These fears proved unfounded as only 2% of the city's population was Chinese. But racist cartoons and inflammatory newspaper articles did a lot of damage. The first real crack in the dam against the Chinese came with the passage of the Burlingame Act of 1868. This law allowed the U.S. government to collect a head tax, basically a special fee, on all Chinese laborers. The money raised was supposed to go towards funding schools and fighting leprosy, but it never did. Instead, the taxman became a way to raise funds for local governments and anti-Chinese riots. 3 years later, the first major anti-Chinese riot broke out in Los Angeles. It was quickly put down, but things would get worse. In 1879, the City Council of Rock Springs, Wyoming passed a series of ordinances forcing Chinese residents to either leave town or register with the police. The ordinances also forbade landlords from renting to them. Riots soon broke out and an angry mob descended on the Chinese residents of Rock Springs. They drove the Chinese out of town, looted their homes and destroyed their businesses. Anti-Chinese violence continued into the early 1880s. And in 1882, Congress passed the Chinese Exclusion Act. President Chester A. Arthur reluctantly signed the measure into law. The new law barred Chinese laborers from entering the U.S. and barred those already in the country from becoming citizens. It also gave federal authorities the power to search ships carrying Chinese people and to deport anyone who violated the law. Even before the law was passed, many states enacted similar legislation. California passed the Alien Land Act of 1880, which barred Chinese people from owning or leasing land. Other states followed suit. Once the Chinese Exclusion Act was passed, the number of Chinese living in America began to shrink rapidly. But enforcement of the law was lax. For the next 10 years, the Chinese continued to enter the country despite the ban. To fix this, Congress passed the Geary Act of 1892. Which required all Chinese in the U.S. to carry identification certificates. Those who did not comply would be arrested and deported. Over 300,000 Chinese people had to register under this law. Most complied, but around 10,000 were arrested and deported anyway. The government also renewed the exclusion for another 10 years with the Geary Act. As historian John F.K. Chung wrote, to a certain degree, the Geary Act succeeded in stemming the tide of Chinese immigration. However, a few Chinese still slipped through the net. After the turn of the century, newspapers began complaining that the Chinese were sneaking into the United States as stowaways or as passengers on so-called white ships. Such charges were difficult to prove, but they indicate that white Americans continued to fear the inroads of the Chinese. In 1902, Congress passed the law that made the restrictions permanent and expanded them further. It barred the immigration of all Chinese, including merchants. The only people exempt from the law were students, teachers, merchants traveling temporarily to the U.S. and the wives and children of those already in the U.S. But the new law made it harder for those people to join their families. Under the previous laws, the wives and children of Chinese men working in America could avoid the head tax if they could prove they were not working. The new law eliminated this exemption. The courts were sometimes able to limit some of the worst effects of the law. In 1905, a Chinese man named Yu Kongjian sued the government. He claimed that he was a merchant exempt from the ban, but was denied citizenship in 1904. Yu Hongjian argued that the law was unfair because it singled out one race for exclusion while exempting others. While the lower court agreed with him, the Supreme Court overturned the decision, saying the Chinese were not being denied equal protection under the law because Congress had a right to exclude any foreigners it wanted. As Justice Edward Douglas White wrote, the power of Congress to exclude or admit foreigners to the country is a very large one, and will be very liberally construed. The word aliens as used in this article of the amendment includes not only those who are foreign-born but all who are not citizens of the United States. This decision was devastating for Chinese Americans. After this ruling, thousands of Chinese people were arrested and deported. By 1910, there were only 92,000 Chinese people left in the U.S. and most of them were women. Many of these women had married white men but were denied citizenship anyway. The courts tried to address this issue in 1922 with the Ozawa v. United States case. A Japanese-American woman named Takao Ozawa sued the government after she was denied naturalization. She had lived in the U.S. for 17 years and knew little about Japanese culture. But the Supreme Court ruled against her anyway. Justice Willis Van Deventer wrote, "We think the word white in the immigration laws and treaties means only persons of the Caucasian race, the same as the word white in the common understanding of mankind means only persons of the Caucasian race." This decision led to the exclusion of other Asians as well, Koreans, Filipinos, Hindus and others. Finally, in 1943, after more than 60 years, the Chinese Exclusion Act was repealed. But the damage done by the law lasted for generations. According to the Immigration Policy Institute, the Chinese were the most victimized racial group during the 19th century, with over 100,000 of them targeted by law enforcement. They were beaten, jailed, tortured, and murdered. The Chinese Exclusion Act is a dark stain on the history of the United States. The racist sentiments that led to the law continue to harm Asian Americans today. Stop and frisk policing, which targets Asian Americans disproportionately because of their race, has been compared to the Chinese Exclusion Act. And the law itself has been cited as inspiration for other countries to pass anti-immigrant legislation. Like the U.S., we hope that learning about these horrific events will help to prevent them from ever happening again. If you enjoyed this video, please share it with your friends, and thanks for watching.